The neighborhood was known for its silence, tucked away from the noise of the city. It was the kind of place where mornings began slowly, sunlight filtering through trees, the distant sound of birds, and people walking their dogs without fear or urgency. Among them was Chuck Norris. To most people, he was just an older man with a calm presence, no bodyguards, no flashy cars, no signs of fame. He had chosen this quiet life deliberately, far removed from the chaos of his past. Walking beside him was his dog, loyal, well trained, and gentle. The dog stayed close, responding to subtle hand signals, moving with discipline that hinted at years of training. It was an ordinary walk, until it wasn't. A police cruiser slowed as it passed them, then stopped. Two officers stepped out. Their posture wasn't relaxed, their tone wasn't friendly. They asked questions that didn't seem necessary: where he lived, why he was there, whether the dog was secured. Chuck answered calmly, respectfully, without resistance. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue, but something was already wrong. The officer's attitude shifted. Their words grew sharper, their patience thinner. They spoke as if they had already decided who Chuck was. Just another man who didn't matter. The dog sensed the tension and moved closer to Chuck's leg, still silent, still obedient. Then, in a moment that stunned everyone nearby, everything spiraled out of control. A command was shouted. Panic replaced reason. And in the confusion that followed, a decision was made. One that could never be undone. The dog collapsed. The street froze. Chuck didn't scream. He didn't rush forward. He slowly knelt beside his companion, placing a steady hand on the dog's side. His face showed no rage, only something far deeper, something colder, something restrained. Bystanders began to gather. Phones came out, whispers spread. Some people looked away, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Others stared at Chuck, expecting an explosion of anger. It never came. Instead, Chuck stood up slowly. He looked at the officers, not with hatred, but with clarity. The kind of look that comes from a man who understands consequences and patience. The officers believed the moment was over. They had no idea it was only the beginning, because they didn't just harm a dog. They crossed a line with a man they never should have underestimated. Silence hung heavy in the air. The officers didn't rush to explain themselves. They didn't check on the dog again. Instead, they began talking, quietly at first, then with confidence, reassuring each other that they had acted by protocol. Their voices carried the cold comfort of authority, the kind that comes from believing rules exist to protect them, not the people in front of them. Chuck listened. He stood still, hands relaxed at his sides, his posture straight but unthreatening. Years ago, he had learned that true control didn't come from reacting, it came from observing. Every word, every gesture, every mistake. One officer finally turned toward him, not with sympathy, but irritation. "You need to step back," the officer said, as if Chuck were the problem. "You're interfering." Interfering, the word echoed in Chuck's mind. Not because it angered him, but because it revealed everything. A small crowd had formed now. Neighbors, joggers, people who had been drawn by the sudden stop of the police cruiser. Some whispered in disbelief. Others shook their heads. A few openly questioned what had just happened, but their voices were quickly shut down. "Move along," the officers ordered. "This doesn't concern you." That was when Chuck realized something important. They weren't afraid of what they'd done. They were afraid of witnesses. One officer began taking notes. Not about the incident, but about Chuck, his name, his address. His tone suggested suspicion, as if this entire situation had somehow been caused by the man who had lost the most. Chuck answered each question calmly. No hesitation, no emotion, no resistance. The more controlled he became, the more uncomfortable the officers seemed. They expected anger. They expected shouting. They expected chaos. What they got instead was discipline. A neighbor spoke up, her voice trembling. "That dog didn't do anything." The officer shot her a look sharp enough to silence her instantly. "Ma'am, this is an active situation." Active? Chuck almost smiled at the irony. Nothing about this was active anymore, except the abuse of authority unfolding in real time. The officers repositioned themselves, subtly boxing Chuck in. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to feel threatening, a power move, a reminder of who they believed was in control. Chuck noticed it immediately. Years ago, he had taught young soldiers how to read body language, how to recognize intimidation tactics before they turned physical. This was textbook, the angled shoulders, the hand resting too close to a holster, the deliberate invasion of personal space. But Chuck didn't flinch. He simply shifted his weight slightly and met the officer's eyes. Not in challenge, but in understanding. That look unsettled them. "Are you refusing to cooperate?" "No," Chuck replied evenly. "I'm cooperating." The simplicity of the answer caught them off guard. There was no accusation, no raised voice. Just truth. That's when the officer made his mistake. "You're lucky we don't take you in right now," he said. Lucky. The crowd reacted immediately. Murmurs grew louder. A few people pulled out their phones again, openly recording now, the balance of power so carefully maintained, began to slip. The officers noticed. Their tone hardened. They spoke faster, louder. They started explaining the law, citing regulations without context, stacking authority on top of authority. It wasn't about justice anymore. It was about control. Chuck let them talk. He understood something they didn't. When people over-explain their power, it's usually because they feel it weakening. One officer finally asked, "Do you have any idea how serious this is?" Chuck paused. For the first time since the incident, he took a breath that everyone noticed. "Yes," he said quietly, "I do." The officers assumed he meant paperwork, or charges, or consequences for himself. They were wrong. What Chuck understood, what he had always understood, was that moments like this define people, not by how much power they have, but by how they use it. The officers turned back toward their cruiser, convinced they had regained control. They believed this was just another incident, another report, another name that would disappear into a system designed to protect its own. They had no idea that every second they spoke, every word they chose, every decision they made was being carefully remembered by a man who had spent his entire life studying consequences. Chuck looked once more at the spot where his dog had fallen. Then he looked up. And for the first time, the calm in his eyes wasn't peaceful. It was deliberate, and something was about to change. Time seemed to slow. The officers moved with the confidence of people who believed the situation was already finished. One leaned against the cruiser, speaking into his radio. The other stood a few steps away from Chuck, arms crossed, eyes scanning the small crowd as if daring someone to interfere. Chuck knelt once more beside his dog. He didn't touch anything unnecessarily. He didn't speak. He simply stayed there for a moment longer than expected, as if acknowledging the loyalty that had walked beside him in silence for years. When he finally stood, his movements were controlled, too controlled. The kind of control that comes from long discipline, not weakness. An officer cleared his throat, as if loss could be dismissed with a command. Chuck looked at him. "We're not done," the officer frowned. "Excuse me. You made a decision," Chuck said calmly. "Now you're accountable for it." That word, accountable, shifted the air. The officer stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Watch your tone." Chuck didn't raise his voice to match it. He didn't step back either. "I'm watching yours," he replied. The crowd grew restless. People exchanged looks. Phones were now openly raised, lenses pointed without shame. The officers noticed, and didn't like it. One of them turned toward the bystanders. "Recording police activity without permission is legal," someone interrupted. The officer stopped mid-sentence. Chuck didn't react, but he registered everything. The growing courage of the crowd, the cracks in authority, the impatience in the officers' movements. Their hands were tighter now, their posture less relaxed. Pressure always revealed character. One officer circled slightly, positioning himself behind Chuck. It was subtle, but deliberate. A containment move. Chuck shifted just enough to keep both in view. That was when the officer snapped. "You think you're smarter than us," he said sharply. "You think you can tell us how to do our job?" Chuck met his gaze. "I think you already know when you've crossed a line." The officer laughed, short and humorless. "You don't get to decide that." "No," Chuck said. "But the truth does. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the officer made it worse. He leaned in and said, just loud enough for the crowd to hear, "Careful. People like you always think they're special." The implication hung in the air. Something in the crowd shifted. Murmurs turned sharper. Faces hardened. Chuck inhaled slowly. This was the moment where silence would have protected him from further trouble. But silence would also mean accepting what had just happened. And Chuck had never lived that way. If you were standing there in his place, what would you do? Would you walk away to protect yourself? Or stand your ground for justice, fey comment walk, or justice is below? The officer mistook Chuck's pause for hesitation. Big mistake. You should be grateful this ends here, the officer continued. Most people don't get that option. Chuck's voice was calm, but it carried. Gratitude isn't owed when harm is done. That sentence landed hard. The officer's face tightened. That's enough. He reached toward Chuck, not to restrain him, but to intimidate. A finger pressed into Chuck's chest. The crowd reacted instantly. Hey! Don't touch him. That's not okay. The officer froze, suddenly aware of how many eyes were watching. Chuck gently removed the officer's hand. Not forcefully. Not aggressively. Just firmly. That was the second line crossed. The officer stepped back, shocked, not by pain, but by the confidence of the movement. Don't, Chuck said quietly. Do that again. The words weren't a threat. They were a boundary. The officer's radio crackled. Another unit was nearby. Backup was coming. Good. Chuck welcomed it. Because this was no longer just about him. It was about what happened when authority believed it could act without consequence. The officers regrouped, whispering to each other. Their confidence had thinned. Their voices dropped. Their eyes darted toward the crowd, then back to Chuck. They still didn't know who he was. But they were beginning to understand one thing. This man was not afraid. Chuck stood tall now. Not in defiance, but in certainty. The line had been crossed. And once crossed, there was no going back. The officers still saw an ordinary man. That was their greatest mistake. To them, Chuck Norris was just someone who had refused to back down. An inconvenience, a complication, a name that would soon be written into a report and forgotten. They didn't see danger. They didn't see history. They didn't see the discipline forged in places most men never survive. They saw calm and assumed it meant weakness. Chuck stood quietly as the officers spoke in low tones near their cruiser. Their body language had changed. Less confident now, more defensive. They knew something wasn't going according to plan, but they couldn't identify what it was. Chuck could. He had spent a lifetime reading situations like this, years ago in environments far more hostile than a quiet suburban street. He had learned that the most dangerous man in the room is often the one who speaks the least. Calm wasn't the absence of emotion. It was control over it. As the officers waited for backup, Chuck's mind drifted, not into rage, but memory. Not flashbacks of violence, flashbacks of discipline. Early mornings before sunrise. Training that pushed men past their limits. Instructors who spoke rarely because weakness revealed itself without words. Missions where hesitation meant failure, and failure meant lives lost. He had learned restraint there. He had learned that power was not something to display. It was something to carry silently. That was why he had chosen this life now. The quiet neighborhood, the slow mornings, the simple routine. He had earned peace, and he protected it fiercely. The dog had been part of that peace. And now it was gone. One officer glanced over, studying Chuck more closely. Something about him didn't add up. His posture was too balanced. His breathing too steady. Even now, surrounded by tension, Chuck stood as if grounded. Like nothing could knock him off center. The officer narrowed his eyes. "Who are you exactly?" he asked. Chuck met his gaze. A citizen. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. The officer scoffed and looked away, clearly unsatisfied. He muttered something to his partner. They laughed softly, trying to reclaim control through mockery. "Guy thinks he's special," one of them said. Chuck didn't react. He had heard worse. From men far more dangerous. The crowd remained gathered, though quieter now. People sensed they were witnessing something unfinished. A few bystanders whispered among themselves, studying Chuck with curiosity rather than fear. One man said quietly, "There's something about him." Another replied, "Yeah, he's not normal." Chuck heard them. He always did, but he didn't acknowledge it. He had learned long ago that revealing who you are too early changes everything. People stop listening, they stop thinking, they start reacting to titles instead of truth. And Chuck wanted the truth exposed first. The officers returned. Standing a little farther back now. "Backup's on the way," Good Chuck said. The word surprised them. They had expected resistance, fear, maybe an attempt to leave. Instead, he welcomed witnesses that unsettled them more than anger ever could. The wind moved through the trees, leaves rustled. Somewhere nearby, a car door closed. Life continued around them, indifferent to the tension thickening in the street. Chuck looked down once more at the ground where his dog had fallen. Then he looked up. His eyes held something the officers couldn't name. Not rage, not grief, not even defiance. It was resolve. The kind that doesn't shout, the kind that doesn't threaten, the kind that waits. Another patrol car approached in the distance, its presence announced by the low hum of tires on pavement. The officers straightened slightly, reassured by numbers. They believed backup meant control. Chuck knew better, because numbers only matter when the truth isn't involved. As the second unit pulled closer, one officer glanced at Chuck again, almost searching for a crack, for fear, doubt, anything human enough to exploit. He found none. Chuck stood exactly where he had been from the start, still balanced, unmoved. They thought authority came from a badge. They thought silence meant surrender. They were wrong on all counts. And soon, very soon, they were going to understand exactly who they had underestimated. Because some men don't need to announce who they are. Their presence does it for them. The second patrol car rolled to a stop. Its arrival didn't bring relief the way the officers expected. Instead, it added weight to the moment, like the air just before a storm breaks. Two more officers stepped out, scanning the scene. The crowd, the phones, the body language of their colleagues. And finally, Chuck. Their eyes lingered on him longer than necessary. Something about the situation didn't match the radio call they had received. One of the new officers approached carefully. "What's going on here?" The first officer answered quickly, too quickly. His words were rehearsed, clipped, defensive. He spoke of protocol, perceived threat, compliance. He spoke around the truth instead of through it. Chuck listened. He had learned long ago that lies unravel fastest when given room to speak. The new officer nodded slowly, absorbing the explanation. Then he turned to Chuck. "Sir, I'd like to hear your side." The original officers stiffened. This wasn't supposed to happen. Chuck didn't rush his answer. He didn't dramatize. He didn't accuse. He simply described events as they had unfolded, calmly, clearly, without emotion. No exaggeration, no hostility, no omission. As he spoke, the crowd leaned in. The street seemed to quiet itself. Even the wind felt still. The more Chuck spoke, the less the earlier version made sense. One of the backup officers glanced at the ground, then at the nearby houses, then back at Chuck. He was paying attention now, not just to the words, but to the man saying them. "Is that accurate?" The officer asked his colleagues. There was a pause, a fraction of a second too long. "That's one interpretation," the first officer replied. Chuck didn't react. He had faced interrogation rooms where silence could stretch for hours. This was nothing. The officer nodded again, slower this time. "I'll need to review everything." The balance shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably. The original officers felt it. They adjusted their stance, their shoulders squared, not with confidence, but with caution. Authority was no longer unquestioned, it was being examined. One of the officers tried to regain control. "Sir, we're still determining next steps. I need you to remain here." "I haven't moved," Chuck replied. It wasn't sarcasm. It was fact. The officer said nothing. The crowd murmured softly. Phones continued recording. Someone whispered, "This isn't going how they thought." Chuck stood quietly, hands relaxed, eyes forward. Inside, however, He was measuring time, not impatiently, precisely. He knew how these moments worked. Pressure didn't explode immediately. It accumulated. The backup officers stepped aside, speaking among themselves. Their tone was professional. Lower now. The original officers stood apart, visibly frustrated. They had lost control of the narrative. And they knew it. Chuck felt no satisfaction, only clarity. This was never about revenge, about standing still long enough for the truth to surface on its own. One of the backup officers returned. "Sir, can you confirm your full name?" Chuck answered. The officer paused. Not long enough to reveal recognition, but long enough to signal something had registered. "Thank you," he said. Chuck nodded once. The officer walked back to the cruiser, likely to run the name, to verify details, to fill in the gaps that behavior alone had already exposed. The wait resumed. But now it felt different. The officers were no longer certain. The crowd was no longer silent. And Chuck was no longer just a man standing in the street. He was a question, and questions make people uncomfortable. Minutes passed. No one spoke. The original officers avoided Chuck's eyes. One kept adjusting his belt. Another stared at the pavement. They were bracing for something they couldn't yet name. Chuck remained exactly as he had been since the beginning. Still composed, unreadable. Not because he was hiding anything, but because men who have faced real reckoning don't rush it. They let it come to them. Somewhere, inside a system built on reports and records, a truth was moving closer to the surface. And when it arrived, everything would change. The calm wasn't peace. It was preparation. The radio crackled softly inside the patrol car. One of the backup officers stood slightly apart, eyes fixed on the screen in his hand. His posture changed, not suddenly, but noticeably. Shoulders stiffened, jaw tightened. He looked up once at Chuck, then back down again, as if confirming what he was seeing. "Officer," he called quietly to the others. "We need to talk." The original officers walked over, confidence returning to their steps, until they saw his face. "What is it?" one asked. The backup officer lowered his voice. "You ran the name wrong the first time." A pause. "What do you mean wrong?" "I mean," he said carefully, "this isn't just some civilian." The officers exchanged looks. The backup officer turned his screen slightly so they could see. Whatever was on it drained the color from their faces. "No," one whispered. "That's not possible." But it was. The backup officer looked toward Chuck again, this time with unmistakable respect. "That's Chuck Norris," he said. "Former Delta Force commander, classified operations, highest level military clearance decorated, retired." The words landed like weight dropped onto glass. The officers froze. The crowd sensed it instantly. Murmurs rippled outward, spreading fast. Did he just say Chuck Norris? No way. That's him. Phones lifted higher. Someone zoomed in. Someone else gasped. The original officers turned slowly toward Chuck. For the first time since this began, they didn't look in control. They looked small. You should have said something," one officer muttered. Chuck met his eyes calmly. "You never asked." Silence. The kind that exposes everything. The backup officer stepped forward, voice firm but respectful. "Sir, I apologize for how this situation was handled." Chuck nodded once. "Apologies don't undo actions." The officer swallowed. "No, sir, they don't." The crowd reacted audibly now. Not cheers. Something deeper. Recognition, vindication, the realization that they had witnessed authority crumble under truth. One of the original officers tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His earlier confidence had evaporated. The badge that once felt invincible now looked painfully fragile. "You treated me the same way you would have treated anyone else you assumed didn't matter," Chuck said evenly. "That's the problem. No shouting, no threats, no triumph. Just truth." The officer looked away. Chuck continued, his voice calm but unmistakably commanding. "My name doesn't change what happened. My history doesn't excuse it. If this was wrong for me, it's wrong for everyone." The words spread through the crowd like fire. This wasn't a man enjoying power. This was a man exposing its abuse. Do you think they would have acted differently if they knew who he was from the start? Comment yes or no below. The backup officer nodded slowly. An internal review will be initiated immediately. The original officers said nothing. They couldn't. The truth had stripped them of every defense. Chuck looked once more at the people gathered around. Respect shouldn't depend on reputation, he said, and justice shouldn't require recognition. No one interrupted him. No one dared. The patrol cars remained parked, but the scene had transformed completely. The same street, the same uniforms, the same badges, different power. Because power had shifted, from authority enforced to authority questioned. Chuck turned slightly, ready to leave. Not because he had won, but because his point had been made. Behind him, officers began quiet conversations about reports, procedures, consequences, real consequences. The crowd slowly dispersed, knowing they had witnessed something rare. Not revenge, not violence, not chaos, but accountability. Chuck walked away calmly. Not as a legend, not as a commander, not as a symbol, just as a man who refused to let injustice pass silently. And the truth, once revealed, could never be taken back. The story didn't end on that street. By the time night fell, clips of the incident had already begun circulating online. Different angles, different voices, but the same unmistakable truth. Millions watched. Not because of who Chuck Norris was, but because of what had happened when authority went unquestioned. Commentators debated it. Legal experts analyzed it. Ordinary people shared it with one sentence attached. This could have been anyone. That was the point. An internal investigation was launched within days. Statements were taken, body cam footage reviewed, procedures examined under a light far brighter than the officers had ever expected. Accountability, once distant and theoretical, became immediate and unavoidable. The officers involved were removed from duty pending review. There were no dramatic arrests, no public spectacle, just consequences, slow, procedural, and real. Chuck never gave a press conference. When reporters reached out, he declined interviews. When social media demanded statements, he offered none. He understood something most people didn't. Justice loses its meaning when it becomes performance. Instead, he released a single written message. It was brief. It didn't mention his name. It didn't mention his service. It didn't even mention the officers. It spoke only of responsibility. Authority exists to protect, not to dominate. Respect should be given freely, not demanded by force. If this moment leads to reflection and reform, then it matters. That message spread just as fast as the video. Not because it was loud, but because it was honest. Community meetings followed. Training reviews were announced. Policy discussions resurfaced, driven by public pressure that refused to fade quietly. The incident became a case study, not of a famous man mistreated, but of how easily power can be misused when assumptions replace judgment. And in that way, the legacy grew beyond Chuck. People remembered the dog, not as a symbol of tragedy, but of loyalty, of innocence caught in the space between fear and authority. A reminder of what's lost when restraint disappears. Chuck returned to his quiet life. The same neighborhood, the same early mornings, the same silence. But something had changed. Neighbors nodded differently now, not with awe, but with respect. The kind that isn't given to legends but to character. Chuck never sought to be remembered for what happened that day. But the world remembered anyway. Not because he revealed who he was, but because he showed who he chose to be. In the end, the true consequence wasn't punishment, it was awareness. And the true legacy wasn't fame. It was the reminder that justice doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to everyone. And sometimes, the strongest response isn't force. It's standing still long enough for the truth to speak.